Greetings, Wargamers. Welcome to MJ Hobby Corner. Today I would like to talk a little bit about a game called Mayhem. The game is designed by author Brent Spivey, Bombshell Games. Mayhem is a mass battle system. It is designed to work with miniatures anywhere from 6 to 15 millimeters, although it can also work with 28 millimeter units. So I've played Mayhem in the past with 15 millimeter and it works very well. So the primary thing about Mayhem, one of the things that attracts me most about this game, is the core mechanic, what the game refers to as the versus system. Now the versus system, one of the things about it that's unique about it is that it uses dice types, not numeric stats for the units. I find that very interesting. D4s, D6s, D8s, all the way up to D20. So the different unit stats will have a dice type instead of a numeric stat. The other very important thing about the versus system that I also like very much is the default versus danger. That's what the game calls this. And basically is the default, you, the player, will have to make decisions during the game when you're going to activate a unit, and you have to decide whether you are going to use the default or risk it and roll whatever die type the stat requires you to roll. So for example, let's check out these orcs. So in this brief example, my orcs have a move of D6, that is the dice that I designated when I created the unit to the particular stat. So in this case, I want to activate the orcs and move them. So I spend the necessary command point to activate, and I decide that I don't want to get too close to the lake over there, so I'm going to go by the default. Now the orcs have a move of D6, and so they're going to move 3 inches. Now keep in mind that these are 15 millimeter, so of course you are going to want to scale down your measurements, in order to fit that. But if they were 28 millimeters, you would move 3 inches. Okay, so that is the default action. Now, for whatever reason, let's say same situation. Now I want my orcs to move a little faster. So this time, after spending my command points, and of course we are saying that this is a different turn, I decided I'm going to go by the danger. I'm going to take the risk and roll the 6-sided dice. And I rolled a 5, which is pretty good. So that risk paid off. And I simply move my orcs to 5 inches. Okay, but there are times when maybe you roll a 1. Well, that orc unit's not going anywhere anytime soon. You may have to use the overdrive technique, the overdrive mechanic, to push them to go further. So by choosing the default, you're going to guarantee that your orcs move at least 3 inches. If you decide, well, I want to see if they can move their full move 6 inches, well, then you roll the dice. That's the danger. You could roll a 1. If you roll a 1, well, guess what? They're moving 1 inch. So it's a very interesting system. It works very well in combat as well. One of the important things about this game regarding melee combat or ranged combat is that both players roll the dice, so it's an opposing roll system. The player that wins the combat is the player that rolls the lowest, not the highest, but the lowest. So if you've ever played Dark Age Apocalypse from Cool Mini or not, you know how that system works. It took me a little while to get used to it, but it works very well in this case. So the player with the lowest dice when attacking is going to win that melee. It is also possible that if you take the danger roll, you could roll a 1. A 1 is a critical hit in this game. So again, it's the decisions that you're going to have to make because of this core mechanic that make the game so interesting. It brings a lot of strategic value to the game. Another important aspect of the Mayhem battle system is that it uses command points. Command points introduce resource management into the game. And this is very interesting. Most actions will cost 1 command point. Command point, you get command points by having a leadership stat, which is, again, a die type. And so the higher your die type for leadership, the better your command points for the turn. What will happen then is if some actions may take more than 1 command point, and so you will have to use these things wisely as you play the game. Now, an interesting thing that is related to command points is the concept of overdrive and deadlock, 2 other very important parts of the core mechanic to this game. In Mayhem, you can push your units with overdrive. And so let's say you needed those last few inches to make that attack on the opponent's unit, but you've already activated, well, you can push that unit with overdrive. When you push a unit with overdrive, of course, the unit doesn't perform as well. It does bring consequences, but it gives you that option in case you really want to push that unit. Overdrive causes exponential rise in the cost of command points. So again, that is a very important aspect. Deadlock, if opponents, players roll a tie during combat, melee, ranged, whatever it is, if they roll a tie, then this is called deadlock. Certain units have special abilities that trigger during deadlock. So that's another interesting and very important concept. During combat, units will have certain dice that were designated to them during army creation. So say the Skellies a D8 and the Orcs a D6. Remember, the lower the number in this game, the better it is. So sometimes in situations like this, taking the default would actually be a benefit. In this case, if I took the default for the Orcs during combat, their score would be a 3, and the Skellies would be a 4. The 3 is, of course, is the better number, and so the Orcs would win the combat. Now, in combat, you can have multiple dice because of certain situations. There's a whole list of them. But no matter how many dice you roll, you only use the best one. So if you're rolling 3 dice, you pick the best one out of the 3, and that's the score. Now, resolving combat introduces another mechanic called harm. And harm basically has 3 different stages of things that can occur in combat. One is disorder, the other is damage, and then the third is called attrition. And I'm not going to explain what each of those mean in this video, but basically just know that most of the units, like your core units, your infantry, your cavalry, your elite units, they all go by the disorder. Anything that's rank and file will go by the disorder mechanic. And anything like this big bony Allosaurus, behemoth, goes by the damage mechanic. And anything like this swarm of killer crows goes by the attrition mechanic. And they're all 3 different categories of harm, of ways that units are harmed in the game, basically, and taken out. And finally, hard counter versus soft counter, that depends on the weapons that the figures are armed with. And hard counter and soft counter will actually modify the dice type by steps. So if, let's say, your guys had a D6 as a dice type, and they're facing a unit that is hard counter against them because of the weapons involved, then instead of a D6, the Skellies will now use a D8, basically one step up, which of course lowers their efficiency as fighters. So that's a concept that's very important, a hard counter versus soft counter. And all of the unit designations have a note on this, or and the weapons that you equip your units with during army creation will tell you what their hard counter or soft counter is. So army creation is very interesting in Mayhem. Players will have the typical fantasy tropes to work with, right? You have what's called unit designations, and those are the things like elites, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, flying units, swarms, right? Anything like that, behemoths. Those are all designations, and there's quite a few of them that the game provides. These unit designations have their own special rules and their own limitations, right? They will also cost a certain number of points. So as you create your army, you will also designate the die type for each of the three major stats: movement, combat quality, ballistic armor rating. Those are the three important stats for the unit. And so you will go, you know, if you're making a dwarf unit, maybe a dwarf axe unit, or whatever it is, you're going to go through the list of die types and choose one that would make sense for, say, movement, combat quality, whatever it is, okay? And there are also some guidelines, for example, and rules about which die types you can use for what units. For example, you can't use D4s in any CQ or bar. Okay, D4s are off limits. You start with D6 all the way up to D20. Now remember, this game works by the lowest combat values, so that's going to also dictate what kind of dice you're going to give what. Okay, so leadership is very important. That's what gives you your command dice. There is a bunch of leadership die types that you can use, and basically, again, you're going to compare the price of each in points and see what makes the most sense for your units. Weapons, very interesting about the way weapons work in Mayhem. Mayhem uses different weapon types. There are things like axes, blunt weapons, spears. Most of them are fairly broad categories. The interesting thing is the way weapons work in units. You have something called soft counter and hard counter. So for example, if you have a human lance unit, a heavy cavalry unit with lances, it may be hard counter versus foot infantry, right? So basically that lancer unit has an edge over foot infantry. Likewise, some heavy infantry, let's say armed with polearms, pikes, halberds, whatever it is, may be hard counters versus cavalry. So weapons cost a certain number of points depending on what weapon it is. Axes, for example, deny the uses of shields. They go through shields, right? So, that's very interesting. This whole idea of hard counter versus soft counter, that helps a lot to give flavor to the units and separate them from each other. So it's interesting because, say if I have a human cavalry unit and my opponent has a human cavalry unit, they may actually be slightly different depending on the die types that we decide to assign. All right, and again, there are guidelines to help make the best choices for the different fantasy tropes, right? Okay, so that's army creation. Now, there is a magic system in the game, and the magic system works with command points. You use command points to cast your spells, but you also use something called magic points, which allows you to, say, alter a dice roll, right, in order that that spell kicks off. So that's a very interesting thing about Mayhem. The other thing is that the spell lists are pretty damn good. It has some pretty good spells, some pretty powerful spells for your sorcerers. So that's a very interesting part of the game. Next is the, you do have war machines, things like artillery. There are powder weapons in Mayhem. You get blunderbusses, you get cannon, right? So if you want to have a dwarf unit with some, let's say, black powder guns or cannon, you can do that. There are ways to do that, and there is a designation specifically for gun crews and that kind of thing. The next interesting thing is the expansion for Mayhem is called Stronghold. You get the expansion whenever you buy the core rules. I paid something like $9.99 on Wargames Vault for both books, and these are PDFs, right? Stronghold gives you rules for garrisons, castles, sieges, fortifications, gives you extra rules for magic, and basically fire, how fire affects things. You can have your archers, for example, shoot flaming arrows. Your artillery pieces will also affect fortifications in Stronghold. So all these things give the game a lot more flavor. It's a very cool game. So that is all I want to say about it. It's a lot in a short time, and there's a lot of little rules to the game. Let me just say the book is 21 pages. There is no artwork in the PDFs, but you can get hard copies of the books. You can still get them, and those do have artwork, as I am told. But I am going strictly by the PDFs. So 21 pages of rules, the core rule set, plus whatever the expansion has, not too bad. Great game. Julie and I will be trying out that game. We will try 15 millimeter and maybe even 28 millimeter. So if you're interested, stay tuned. We'll have some battle reports in the future. Thank you, guys. Have a great one.